basically what I want to give you today is an overview of implementing Google Maps into your website or application if you want to do that. Now there's a few ways that you can go about doing this. There's sort of the easy way, which is less flexible, and then the slightly more difficult way, which gives you more flexibility. It's up to you if whichever method you want to use, if indeed you want to use it at all. But I guess mapping and geolocation is something that's becoming very, very common. So even if you don't plan to use it in your prototype, then it's probably worthwhile knowledge to have anyway. So I'll start with the I guess the easy way to implement a Google map. And the easiest way to do that is simply to go to the Google Maps website and do a search. So let's say I want to search for some McDonald's near to where I am. Okay, so any map that you actually browse or search for, you can embed that map as is quite easily into a web page. You'll notice there's this little link button here, which you can simply just click, and it will give you a snippet of HTML, which you can simply copy and paste into a web page in order to get that to work. So I can go over to my web page here that I've just created, paste that in, and then view this in my web browser. Okay, and I get an embedded map like this, which will still allow me to scroll around and interact with it. Okay, so I can get an interactive map. So if that suits you for as much as you want a prototype, then that's really quite easy. You simply just go to Google Maps, do the search that you want, click the embed link, and then copy and paste that single line of code into your web page where you want it to show up, and it will show up exactly like this and still be all interactive. Okay, so that is the simple method of embedding Google Maps. But of course, sometimes we might want to have more flexibility, in which case there is a Google Maps API which allow us to basically do whatever we want with the maps as well. So the Google Maps API documentation lives at this address, developers.google.com/maps/documentation/javascript. If we just go to Maps, you'll notice there's different APIs for different technologies. So there's APIs for embedding in phones and Google Earth API, stuff like this. But the one that we're interested in is the JavaScript API. Okay, so there's a lot of information about the Google Maps API here. Like most things, you're probably only going to be interested in small subsections of this, and some of the language here can get kind of technical, but you can actually get away a lot of the time with simply just looking at the example code they give you for doing certain things and then copying that and then modifying it to suit your needs. Okay, so probably the best place to start when you're looking at this is the developer's guide and the getting started, and that generally explains all of the introductory stuff as how you actually get a Google map showing up into your website. Now it talks about obtaining an API key, and that's something you can do if you want, but from my experience it will work even if you don't have an API key, so I'm not going to bother adding that in just for this example. Okay, so I've got here a blank HTML page which I'm going to use for my Google Maps example. And the first thing that we need to do is include the Google Maps JavaScript API in our web page by embedding a script tag. And you can find this easily on the documentation in where it says here loading in the Google Maps API. You can simply just copy and paste this script tag here. Okay, which is exactly what I'm going to do, and I'm going to copy and paste that into the head section of my code. Now I have to change a couple of things here because I haven't filled out everything. You'll see there's a section here where it says key equals your API key, so if you did sign up for an API key, that's where you'd enter that in there. I'm not going to use one, so I'm just going to get rid of that. But you are required to specify this sensor property here, and you're meant to either set it to true or false, and that will depend on the target device that you're using, whether it has a location sensor like GPS. So the long and short of this is essentially, if you're targeting a mobile phone, you put true in here. If you're targeting a desktop application, you put false in here. Now from what I understand, whether you put true or false there doesn't actually have any impact on how it operates. It's simply something for Google to use because they charge differently based, their licensing arrangements are different based on the device that you use. Okay, so in effect doesn't matter, but you should put it to true or false based on whether you're targeting a device with GPS or not. So because I'm doing this on the computer, I don't have a GPS chip, so I'm going to put false there. Okay, so that then will load. As you can see, this will load a JavaScript file, okay, which contains all the code which we then reference for the Google Maps API. Now the other script that I'm going to load is just the jQuery script, because I'm going to be using that a little bit. You don't require the jQuery script for Google Maps, but I'm going to be using it for selecting and event handling and stuff like that, so I'm going to include that as well. Now the only other thing that we really need to add to the HTML part of the web page is we just need to create an empty div element which will contain the map. So I'll create a div here, and you give it an ID, and in the Google examples I always call it map-canvas, so I'll just stick with that. And I'm just going to put an inline style up here, okay, to set the size of my map canvas div. I'm going to give it a height of 500 pixels. If I don't do that, it's just going to collapse down to nothing and I won't see it. Okay, so that's the basic skeleton of the page for setting up Google Maps here. We have the div, give it a specific height, and then we load the Google Maps JavaScript API. So if we look at this in the browser now, okay, it won't look like anything. Okay, we've just got empty divs. Okay, so what we need to do is write some JavaScript to actually initialize the Google Map. So, but before I even do that, there's sort of two parts to this actually, and they're often used together, but they're actually two separate things. So when you hear about geolocation, geolocation is the browser's ability to tell you where the user happens to be when they're accessing the page there. So all geolocation is simply being able to ask the browser what is the current location of this user. Now, whether they're on a phone, they have a GPS chip, or they're on a computer, and it will use other things like routers and Wi-Fi and all this other clever stuff to attempt to estimate your location. All that's doing is essentially giving you numbers for latitude and longitude. But then we can combine that geolocation with Google Maps to actually display that. So the first thing I'm actually going to show you is geolocation, and it's not necessarily Google Maps feature, but because Google Maps is all about mapping, is all about location, then it makes sense that they go hand in hand. So I'm going to create a script tag here to put my custom scripts in. And I'm going to put the jQuery document.ready handler here to make sure that my scripts don't get executed until the page is fully loaded. Now you might notice in some of the Google Maps examples that they use something like this: google.maps.event.add-on listener window load, and then a callback function. That's essentially exactly the same as doing the jQuery ready function or the window.onload event. So it doesn't really matter too much which way you do that. I'm just using the jQuery ready function for no particular reason, then I've decided to use it. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is look at actually getting the current location of the user. So we can look up. Okay, if you just Google HTML5 geolocation, you'll find a bunch of information about it. Okay, so geolocation is one of the new HTML5 features, but the way that you access it is actually by interacting with the browser with JavaScript, as is a lot of the HTML5 features. But anyway, essentially what you're interested in is JavaScript can access this browser object called Navigator, and it has a property called geolocation. So we can call a function called navigator.geolocation.getCurrentPosition, okay, and then we pass it the name of a function to call when it's got the position, and then that will allow us to know where it is that the user is at that given time. Okay, so that's exactly what I'm going to do here. Navigator.geolocation.getCurrentPosition. Okay, and because this could take a while, this is not an immediate thing, then the way that we do it is we give it the name of a function to call as soon as the location is returned. So that's what I'm going to do here, and I'm going to create a function called initialize. Okay, and I'll create that function up here. Okay, and you'll notice in the examples here that function will get passed an object which contains information about the current location of the user. So we can call this whatever we want here. Location. Alright, and just to test that this is going to work, I'm going to write console.log location. Okay, now this is a lot more brief than a lot of the geolocation example code that you will see if you go and look for this. All the rest of the stuff that they have there, which is stuff you technically should add, but just I think sort of confuses it while you're trying to learn, is all about error handling. So you specify a different function if it fails to return a location and all this sort of thing. But essentially, this is the most basic example that you need to get this to work, assuming that it is going to work. Okay, so in your browser, as part of the specification for geolocation, you're meant to before you return the location, you're meant to get permission from the user. So if you ever use this, you'll see such and such is requesting to know your location, and if the user hits no, then it's going to return an error. So you should technically handle for that, but I'm happy in your prototype to assume that they will always say yes. Okay, so let's see what this looks like in the example. I'm going to refresh the page here. So I'll do that again. Okay, and you'll see. Alright, let's just try this again. Okay, so after a little while, it returns a, it will call that initialize object, returning a location object, and then I'm printing that out to the console. So this is the information that the navigator.geolocation.getPosition returns. Okay, and so this is all of the potential information that the browser can tell you about where the user is. Gives us an accuracy. In certain instances, if the device has a altimeter, then it will give you the altitude, and potentially it can give you a heading and a speed as well. Okay, but the two things that we're mainly interested in are the latitude and longitude here. Okay, so once we know these, we can then plug those values into Google Maps, and we can get a map that is centered around where the user is. And that, I guess, the most common thing that you're going to want to do. Usually you're showing a map centered where the user is, and then you're attempting to show things that are around there. So now that we've got that information, we'll look at actually initializing the actual map. So first of all, I'm going to declare a few variables up here outside of the function scope, just so that I can access them from inside any of the other functions that I might want to use later. The first one I'm going to create is a variable called map, which simply will just store a reference to my Google Maps object. Now, the way that we create the map is sort of two parts. We first create an object that looks like this, which contains some options which describe how we want the map to display. So in this case, the minimum requirements for describing a map are to give it a center property, which is telling us what latitude and longitude we want the map to be centered around, a zoom value, which is simply just a number. The higher the number, then the more zoomed in the map will be. And then a map type ID, which is the default style of map we want to show, whether that be a road map or a satellite map or a terrain map. Okay, so I'm simply going to copy this bit of code and use these same values and then modify them a bit. Okay, so there's my map options object there that I've just created. So you can see for this center object here, this takes a special kind of Google Maps object, which is defined as google.maps.latlng. So that's an object which holds a latitude and a longitude. So here they've been hard-coded in, but ultimately we can replace them with the values that are returned by our browser's geolocation ability. Then we've got the zoom and the map type ID. Okay, so again in the documentation you'll find all the values for these. I'm just going to leave it to that default road map there. Okay, so we've got our object which describes how we want the map to look. And then, okay, so this part is all explaining all of those different properties. Okay, but the thing that actually creates the map is this line of code here. Okay, so we define the map and we initialize it. Okay, I've already declared my map variable up here, so I just need to go map equals, and then we say new google.maps.map. Okay, remembering that case is important, so that capital M is important. And then that function takes two parameters. The first one is a page element, which is where we want to load the map into. And in this case, I'm using document.getElement by ID map canvas to refer to this empty div with the ID of map canvas down here. Okay, so that's how we tell Google Maps to load the map into this particular HTML element. And then the second is simply our map options object, which tells Google Maps how to display the map. So once we've done all that, okay, we should have a map that gets loaded into the web page. Okay, so I'm going to refresh now and we'll see what happens, and there we go. Okay, so there's my map. So obviously this is using the hard-coded coordinates from the example here, okay, which appears to be somewhere around Sydney. So that's where it shows us, okay, and we can interact with this, zoom in, zoom out. We can use Street View. We can use the satellite view. Okay, we get all of the normal Google Maps functionality there. So the first thing I'm going to change about this is, rather than use the hard-coded values here, I want to use the latitude and longitude values that were returned from my request to the browser's get current position. Okay, so, and I can find those by looking at the console output here to see that it's that location object, which inside it has another object called coords, which has properties latitude and longitude. So if I want to use those instead here, I can simply replace these values here with location, okay, referring to this object here, which I had passed from the get current position, location.coords.latitude, and location.coords.longitude. Okay, so now that should be using my current location values when it loads up and centers the map. Okay, and there we are. Alright, so we get centered around Brisbane. And if I change this zoom value here to something higher, let's say 12, then we might be able to get a better idea of just how accurate it's going to be. Even higher. Okay, so you can see, even though I don't have a GPS chip in my laptop, okay, it's using quite clever technology with all of the networking infrastructure to actually figure out pretty accurately exactly where I am. Okay, so I might set my default zoom there to be about 12. Okay, something like that. Now, normally frequently what you might want to do is actually put some sort of marker on the map which represents where the user happens to be, so we don't have to estimate where the exact middle of this map is. So that's the next thing I will demonstrate. Okay, and you can see all of the you can see the documentation for layers under the category of overlays here. Okay, so there's a whole different there's lots of different kinds of overlays that you can use, and one of the most common is markers here, which we'll look at. So markers are added in a similar way that the map itself is added. We create a marker object, which is type Google Maps marker, and then we pass it an object which contains information that describes the position of the marker, the map that we want to attach it to, okay, because it is possible that we'll have more than one map on the page, and then various other stuff. Okay, so I will copy that line there. Okay, so here's me initializing my marker. Okay, and the position I want to put at, well, my current location. So I could essentially write this line of code again, but because I'm writing this multiple times, it makes sense to me to take this out and declare a variable here. Let's call this current location and set that equal to that object there, and then every time I want to use it, I can just use current location in its place. Okay, there and there, and the map. Okay, the map is essentially just the reference to our variable which contains the Google Maps map. In my case, it's just called map. Okay, so I type in map here. Okay, so that then should place a marker at our current position. So I'll refresh that. Okay, and there it is. There's the marker that represents where we are right now. So I'll zoom in and we'll see how accurate that might actually be. Okay, so it's a little off, but where are we actually? Probably somewhere over here. Okay, but given the fact that I don't have a GPS chip, that's actually pretty damn impressive that it manages to get that close. Okay, and if I was to run this on a phone using the GPS, it should find me down to, if I have good signal, pretty much down to like a few meters. Okay, so that is the marker representing exactly where we happen to be right now. Okay. Now, probably by far the most common thing that people are going to want to do with Google Maps is actually to do some form of a search and then display those search results on the map. Okay, so searching for nearby whatevers. So we can do that as well, and I will demonstrate. And we will find the information on this under libraries over here, and there is a library called the Places Library. So the Places Library allows us to search for nearby places. Okay, so the first thing that using any of these libraries is going to tell you is we have to modify our the script slightly, which loads the Google Maps API, and we have to include this parameter here, which says libraries equals and then the name of the libraries that we want to include. So in this case, the library is called Places. So we need to add this little bit of code here to our Google Maps API script. Okay, so, and I'm going to add it in there, and because I now have multiple parameters here, I must separate these with an ampersand. Okay, so remembering everything after the question mark is all a set of key value pairs, so we have libraries equals places and sensor equals false. Okay, so that will then load a little bit more JavaScript code, which will enable us to use the Places library. So there's a few different ways that you can do a search, and they're all described here, but they're all fairly similar in practice of implementing them. So I'm just going to demonstrate this first one here, which is a nearby search. Okay, and again, this is going to give you the code that you need to do this. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new function because it's possible that I'm going to want to perform this search multiple times. So I'm going to create a function up here called perform search. Okay, and so what I need to do for any of these searches, first of all, is I need to create this object called service, which is essentially the object which performs searches for me. So because I'm going to refer to that in multiple functions, I'm going to declare that variable up here, service. And I'm going to create the service inside my initialize function. Like this. Okay, I've just copied and pasted that, but essentially again we just create a new google.maps.places object called places service, and then we pass it a reference to our Google Maps object. Okay, and then to actually perform the search, we do something like this line of code here. And I'll put this in my perform search function here. So we'll say something like service.nearby search. Okay, and then we give it a request object, which is very similar to giving our map a map object. Okay, it describes the type of search that we want to do. And then also a callback function which will handle the results. Okay, so again, all of this stuff, because it has to send it to Google and reply, we do it this way asynchronously, such that we give it a function to call when it's finished, rather than just waiting until and pausing until we actually get a result. So the request object, first of all, you will see demonstrated in some of these examples. Okay, it looks something like this. Okay, a request object. Again, it's just an object with a bunch of options here. So what I want to do, if for example I want to find again nearby McDonald's, okay, then I can create a request object that looks something like this. So request equals, okay, and so I need to give it, it tells me up here that I need to either give it, so there's two ways of defining what the location I want to restrict my search to is, because I don't want to search all over the world, I want to search stuff nearby me. I can either give it a location and a radius within which to search, or I can give it a rectangular bounds object. And I'm going to demonstrate the use of the rectangular bounds object, because I'd say that's possibly the more common way that you want to do it, and also the slightly more difficult way. So if you know how to do that, it's easy to implement the radius method. But essentially the search I want to perform, I'm not going to bother looking for anything that's actually outside the bounds of the currently visible map. Okay, so what I'm going to do is say, okay, search, and restrict your search to the area that is defined by the current visible bounds of the map. So the way that I do that is I specify this property called bounds, and I can get the current visible bounds of the map by simply saying map.getBounds like so. Okay, I think that's correct. Let me just check that. Yep, okay, that's correct. Okay, so that will restrict the search to just whatever's visible on the map at the moment. And the only other thing, there's heaps of stuff that you can search for, and it's all detailed. It's all detailed here on in the documentation. You can search for specific types of things and search for things that are only open at that particular time, things like price levels. All I really want to do is search for stuff that's named McDonald's. So I'm simply going to add this parameter name here and type in the name McDonald's. Okay, so they're the only two things that I'm going to send as part of my request object to the search. Okay, so it should find me McDonald's restaurants that are within the current map bounds. Okay, and then I have to define this callback function here, which is going to handle the results. So let's say I call this handle search results, and I'll create that function up here. Okay, and again from the example code, you'll see that in the callback function it will get past two things: the actual results and then the status. So the status will basically say whether or not the search performed successfully. And again, to be perfectly correct, you should do error checking like this to make sure that the status is okay. But again, just to keep it really simple, I'm going to assume that it's working, and I'm just going to deal with handling the results. Okay, but even so, we have to specify results and the status in the function definition. Okay, and again, what I usually like to do just to test that this is working is simply to output the results object to the console log. Okay, but there's actually one more thing I have to do first. I haven't actually at any point in my initialize function called this perform search function. Now, the logical thing to do would be simply to call the function perform search like that. But what you'll find is if you're doing this and you're using this particular method of specifying the location of the search to restrict it to, that we'll actually get an error in the console, I believe. Okay, so I get this error here, uncaught error, missing parameter, you must specify a location. So what that's actually telling me is that this map.getBounds is not returning me a result. And the reason that is because when I load the page, you'll notice that the map takes a certain amount of time for it to render. So if I am calling this perform search function before the map is fully rendered, then it's not going to know what the bounds actually are yet. So there's a fairly simple way to get around this, and all I do is use this particular bit of code here. Okay, which again I've just taken from one of the existing examples. Okay, which essentially does the same thing. Okay, it calls this perform search function. Okay, but it does it based on an event listener to wait until the bounds have changed. So what this is going to do is actually wait until the bounds of the map exist before it calls that perform search. So it's a little bit cryptic, but that's just the way we do it. And as you can see here, this is add listener once rather than add listener. I could do add listener, but what this will do is any time I zoom in or out, it will perform that search sort of hundreds of times, and it will pretty quickly start rejecting my search requests because I'm surpassing my limit. Okay, so that's what we have to write to get this particular code to work. Alright, so once we've done that, it should, as soon as the map is loaded and the bounds exist, call the perform search function, where the request then successfully defines the map's bounds and the name of the search, performs the search. When the search completes, it will call this handle results function, and the console log should output the returned results. So let's try this again. We'll refresh. Okay, and there we go. So this is the result of outputting those search results to the console log. As you can see, it's returned 19 objects here. Okay, and if I inspect these, I can see the information that it returns. So there's a name which says McDonald's, so that's encouraging. That looks like that's probably the right thing. We have also, probably what's important is, to me, is this the geometry object, which contains a location object, okay, which has a latitude and a longitude. So what I can do is use this information to then, for each of these search results, create a marker and place those on the map. Okay, so because at the moment on the map, even though we've returned the results, we have no way of visualizing them. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, because we have a list of results, which could be any number of items long, this tells me that I'm going to need some sort of loop structure, so I'll create a for loop. Okay, so I'm creating a for loop which is going to loop over all of the results, the search results for me. And then for each of these search results, I'm going to create a new marker and place it on the map. Okay, so I'm going to do this essentially exactly the same way that I did the first marker. So I'll just copy and paste that code and then modify it. Okay, and so again, I want to attach it to my map object that I've already defined up here. But the position, I don't want them all to turn up in my current location. I want them to appear where the search result objects say they are. So the way that I'm going to reference this is the result .geometry.location. So the position will be results i.geometry.location. Okay, and because that's already in the form of a google.maps.latlng object, I don't have to go and create that specifically. Alright, so now if I run this, it should, okay, place a bunch of markers all around where all of the search results are. Okay, so each of these little dots represents a McDonald's. Now, the problem with visualizing it this way is each of these search results look exactly the same as the marker which represents where I am. So that gets a little bit confusing. But fortunately, you can specify a custom icon for any of these search results. And there's a couple of ways you can do this. You'll notice in the search results that there's actually an icon property here which links to a PNG file, in this case for restaurants. So I could use that. And the way I do that is simply just to expand my options object for the marker and use the icon. And I can say results i.icon. Alright, let's see what this does. Okay, and there we go. So this shows us now the restaurant icon that Google actually provides. I can, although as well, include my own custom icons. So what I can do is in my files here, okay, I've got an images folder with a McDonald's PNG, which is just the McDonald's logo here. So I could actually use that as well. So instead of using the built-in one, I can say icon and then simply just write the relative path to that image file. So it's images/mcdonalds.png. Okay, and then it will use that to represent the restaurants instead. So I imagine anyone who's wanting to use this in their assignment, you probably have whatever it is that you're wanting to represent, you probably have an idea of what icon might represent that best. So it's quite easy to use your own custom icons like that. Okay, let's see how we're going for time. Not bad. Alright. So that now already is probably, I mean, that gives you a pretty functional looking map like that. Now, what we can also do is, because I've sort of modularized my perform search function here like this, I can call it over and over again, and I can, if I want, I'm just gonna put a few HTML buttons down here. You'll notice when I zoom out, okay, perhaps my user is going to want to zoom out and perform the search based on a wider search range. So what I can do is I can hook up this refresh button here to actually call the search to be performed again every time I click that button. Okay, and that's quite easy to do with a little bit of jQuery. So I'm just going to copy and paste this. So down here in my initialize function, I'm simply going to use a jQuery selector to set up a click handler on my refresh button down here, which will simply call the perform search function again whenever I click it. Okay, so if I refresh again here, and then I zoom out, and I want to re-perform the search again, I can simply click the refresh button there, and you'll notice that it performs the search again, but using a wider sort of radius or boundaries for search. Okay, so I'll just demonstrate a couple of other types of overlays that you can add. You can add a huge number of overlays really, and they are all documented here under overlays, but I'm just going to demonstrate. Maybe this circles one. So what you can do is you can actually draw shapes over the map as well to represent certain things. So let's say you want to represent a circle that represents a certain radius from the user, so they can see maybe what's within a 1,000 meter or 5,000 meter radius. So I can do that using the certain overlays in Google Maps as well. So again, just to save a bit of time, I'm going to copy and paste a little bit of code here. Okay, so this bit of code here will actually draw me a circle on the map. And again, you're probably noticing a pattern here is whenever you're creating an object on the Google Maps, it's essentially a two-step process. You define an object which describes what that thing you're adding to the map is going to look like, and then you actually add it to the map. So in this case, I've got an object here which describes a circle. So I have a stroke color, stroke opacity, stroke weight, fill color, fill opacity, a map, which I want it to link to, and then a center point as well. And here I could just use my my current location object. Don't need to write all that out again. And an important thing here is the radius. So the radius here is specified, the documentation will tell you in meters. So what adding this circle is going to do is going to give me a circle with particular style, centered at my current location and with a radius of 2,000 meters on the map. So maybe this is useful if I want to indicate to the user which of these McDonald's happens to be within sort of a reasonably comfortable walking distance. Okay, and then finally I add it to the map by creating the circle and just creating a new google.maps.circle and passing it the circle options object that I defined. Okay, and so we can see the result of doing this. Okay, there it is. So there's the center marker for me, and then there's my circle, which is defining a radius of 2,000 meters in any direction from my current location. Okay, so if I want to make that smaller, I want to make it 1,000 meters. Okay, I simply change that value in the circle options object. Set that back to 2. Okay. Now the last two overlays I'll show you is again may be useful, and the first one I want to show you is now these Okay, now, so these are actually separated in a different category from overlays. These ones are layers, and I guess layers you can interpret as things that sort of cover the whole map. Okay, so there's a lot of options for layers here. An interesting one to look at might be KML and GeoRSS layers. You can actually overlay geotagged RSS feeds onto the map. So if you wanted to do something, for example, where you were like locating Twitter updates on a map, you could do something like that with that. I'm just going to show you something simple, the traffic layer here. Okay, and again, this gives you essentially the exact code that you need to include this. Okay, and it looks something like this. So in my case, because I don't want it on all the time, what I'm going to do is I've got this traffic button here, and when I click that, I want to toggle the visibility of the traffic layer. Okay, so in my code here, so first of all, I'm creating I need to create a traffic layer object. Okay, and I do that by saying new google.maps.traffic-layer. But then here I simply have a click handler function on my traffic button, and I say, well, if the traffic layer.getMap, if the traffic layer already has a map, then this is the way that I remove it. I say traffic layer.setMap null. Otherwise, if it's not already visible, then traffic layer.setMap map, and that will make the traffic layer visible on the current map that I'm looking at. So if I save that and refresh, okay, now when I click my traffic button here, okay, I should be able to see my traffic layer up here, and then I click it again and it disappears, and I can do that as many times as I want. Okay, and then finally, last example is we can do a very similar thing with the weather. Okay, so perhaps for whatever reason you might want to overlay weather data onto the map. Okay, and I'm doing this again using, again, just creating a weather layer object. In this case, I'm using an options object to specify that I want the temperature units in Celsius rather than Fahrenheit. And I include here also a cloud layer, which is actually separate to the weather layer, but they're both weather related. So what I'm doing here again, very similarly to how I toggled the traffic layer, is when I click it, if they're not already there, I add them to the map. If they are already there, I remove them from the map. Now, the only difference here is I believe we have to include another library to use the weather. So all we really need to do is go up to libraries here, and where I have libraries equals places, I'm just going to add a comma and also add weather. Okay, we refresh. Okay, let's just check. My traffic layer still works. Good. Okay, and my weather layer, when I click that, should also work. Okay, so you can see that I've got sort of weather forecasts come up here as well. And if I zoom out far enough, okay, I also get this clouds layer here. Okay, which should disappear when I turn it off like that. Okay, and I can combine the traffic layer as well. I can refresh and redo my search. Okay, so hopefully you're kind of seeing a pattern as to how we add stuff to Google Maps. Usually it's you define an object which specifies how you want to customize that, and then you create it and add it to the map. So the process for any of these other things is going to be pretty similar. So my suggestion would be to simply look through this, look through the code examples, and probably just copy and paste their example code and then modify it until it does what you want. So you've got other things, you've got directions, if you want those, lots of different stuff, lots of overlays, different events that you can respond to. Okay, and it all works sort of in a similar way. And then combining that with how we already know how to interact with elements on the page by clicking them and so forth, you can have quite an interactive map there. So as I said at the beginning, it's up to you if you think you need this or not for your prototype. If you'd rather just mock this stuff up, that's totally fine. But if you want to get something sort of functional, then it shouldn't take too much effort to get that to work, I wouldn't think.